Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is great to be in the venue again. This afternoon, we're going to look at the technology development that forever changed naval warfare and made wooden vessels obsolete. Now, during this lecture, we're not going to take a look at Union River ironclads such as the USS Cairo. That's a talk for another time. Next slide, please. There we are. So throughout the course of the Civil War, there was a very clever mixture of ingenuity with new designs and technology development. There's use of iron, particularly with the artillery and the construction of vessels. And then the ingenuity piece, the ever-changing types of caliber of artillery, new innovations with the vessels, each side, Union and Confederate, trying to get a winning combination to win the war at all costs. Next slide. So we're going to begin with a look at ironclad technology, but centuries before the Civil War. The world's first effective ironclad vessel that was in combat was in Korea. On the top left of this slide, you'll see the turtle ship design, which was used by Admiral Yi and the Korean Navy to defeat a Japanese invasion in 1592. The vessel design had iron plates over a wooden frame, which resembled a turtle. Now, just before the beginning of the Civil War, I don't have to tell this audience about HMS Warrior, which was the pinnacle of ironclad technology, along with its twin ship HMS Black Prince. The French Navy, not to be outdone, had built Le Gloire, which was equal to HMS Warrior in technology. Now, on the bottom right of this, on the top right of this slide, you'll see the early beginnings of ironclads in the United States. Begins with the Stevens Floating Battery. And this venture began as early as the 1840s. It was designed and built around New York City and the Hoboken, New Jersey area. And it was largely a floating battery with a wooden casemate with iron plating on top of it. Now, this design was proved impractical for naval warfare. It was very heavy, and moving it due to engine technology earlier before the Civil War made it impractical for the Union Navy to take this on at the beginning of the Civil War. Next slide. So on April 12, 1861, Virginia State forces under the command of Major General William Booth Taliaferro seized control of the Norfolk Navy Yard. As the Union Navy forces had tried to withdraw from Norfolk, they made an attempt to destroy everything of military value, sink ships, and destroy weapons. This Navy Yard was of such an expansive size that was virtually an impossible task. Despite the large-scale destruction, Virginia State forces captured over 1,200 naval artillery pieces, 2,800 barrels of gunpowder, and large amounts of other military equipment. Now, this artillery would be used to arm Confederate batteries ranging from Manassas all the way to Mobile. However, the burnt-out hull of the USS Merrimack was recovered, as well as the Navy Yard's dry dock was intact. Now, this dry dock would be used later on in the construction of the ironclad CSS Virginia. Next slide, please. Now, looking at the Union and Navy Confederate leadership, there was a contrast in their perspective on ironclad vessels. Union Navy Secretary Gideon Welles looked at ironclads as a distraction. He at the beginning, did not appreciate the game-changing technology that the Union Navy would need to win the war. On the other hand, Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, he recognized the game-changing potential of the ironclad concept completely. He was looking to break the Union blockade of southern ports and win the war. Next slide. Now, the first Confederate ironclad of the Civil War was the CSS Manassas. It was built in Louisiana as a private venture. It was armed with one 32-pounder artillery piece, It was used in combat later against Farragut's fleet that was making the run towards New Orleans. Now, it was not an effective technology, but you see how the Confederates tried to get out early with the use of ironclads. Next slide. Now, as we look at the CSS Virginia, John Luke Porter and John Mercer Brooke were the principal designers of the CSS Virginia. John Luke Porter submitted his design for an ironclad vessel on the 1st of June, 1861. John Mercer Brooke was a genius of naval artillery and ironclad vessel design. The burnt hull of the old USS Merrimac was taken and put in dry dock at the Norfolk Navy Yard for its conversion into the ironclad CSS Virginia. Now, to be clear, the term also Merrimac was used by the Confederates at times during the construction of this vessel. But for our purposes in this lecture, I'm going to refer to it as the CSS Virginia. Now, the iron for the Virginia, the iron for the construction of the ironclad Virginia came principally from the state of Virginia. But Confederates had to scour far and wide to find enough iron to build the iron plate for this vessel. Some of it came as far away as the Cane Creek furnace in Alabama. Now, on this this drawing of the Virginia during its construction, note the ram on the front of the ironclad. This feature of vessels goes all the way back to antiquity and was featured in the navies of ancient Greece, Carthage, and Rome, for example, where the ancient vessels would try to ram the opponent's ship. And this was a principal feature of the tactics for employment of Confederate ironclads. And even after the Battle of Hampton Roads that I'll talk about later, the concept of ramming the enemy vessel was still used. So later ironclads did not include this ram, but instead had a reinforced hull. And so often in Union press, Confederate ironclads were referred to as rams. Next slide. I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the experimentation that was done to support the ironclad, the iron plating on the Virginia. So at Fort Pocahontas on the James River, a series of experiments was carried out by Catesby Jones, where he used a modified 32-pounder artillery piece, which had been rifled. This was one of the 32-pounders that was captured at Norfolk. And this rifled artillery was tested against various sized iron plates. So this experimental firing was used to determine exactly how much iron plating should be placed on the on the Virginia for it to withstand future Union naval fire. So Catesby Jones would later be executive officer on board the CSS Virginia. Next slide. So to crew and equip the ironclad, Captain Franklin Buchanan was selected for command of the CSS Virginia. He had to go far and wide all across Hampton Roads to find enough crew for his ship. For example, he was able to go recruit from amongst the Confederate Army of the Peninsula to get sailors that they were soldiers at the time, but had previously been sailors or had worked in the maritime trade before the Civil War. There's some good examples of troops from Virginia as well as Mobile, Alabama, that were in other southern ports that were recruited for the crew of the Virginia. Also, for the officers of the Virginia, Franklin Buchanan had his pick of all the top people, like Catesby Jones. The ship would be armed with a combination of 9-inch Dahlgrens, which had been captured at Norfolk, as well as brand new rifled Brooke artillery, which was manufactured at Richmond's Tredegar Ironworks. In this image, you'll see a naval gun carriage, which was a Dahlgren gun carriage, potentially from the Virginia, as well as a piece of iron plate that was on the Virginia. Next slide. Now, on the Union Navy side, we need to begin our examination of this story with John Dahlgren, and he was a genius of naval artillery. He's the one that came up with the innovative Coke bottle artillery design for the Dahlgren artillery piece. Next to that is a 11-inch Dahlgren, which was used in the USS Monitor, which is currently undergoing conservation at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. So these Dahlgren guns, during the Civil War, you had guns ranging from 9 inches all the way to 15-inch that could shoot smooth bore projectiles. And the Dahlgren was the focal point, was the centerpiece, was the primary naval artillery piece of the Union Navy during the Civil War. Next slide. Now, as we look at the USS Monitor, it was designed by John Erickson, an inventor and an innovator that the Union Navy was late to appreciate. He came up with many innovative designs that are standard for even naval ships today. The rotating turret, for example. Now, Gideon Wells didn't fully appreciate the game-changing technology that the USS Monitor represented. He was more along the lines of the old guard in the Union Navy. Now, it was certainly the existence of when the existence of the CSS Virginia became known in the Northern press, the USS Monitor was really rushed into service. I'd also like to highlight the contributions of Lieutenant John Warden. His picture is down in the bottom right. Certainly a veteran officer of the pre-war Navy. He had been sent on a secret mission to Pensacola at the beginning of the Civil War and was trying to return north when he was intercepted in Montgomery, Alabama. And he spent a number of months in jail in Montgomery, Alabama before the Battle of Hampton Roads. Now, when he was released and recuperated, he was eventually placed in command of the USS Monitor. And just also on this particular slide, you see the anchor as well as the screw propeller that come from the Monitor. These are among the many artifacts of the USS Monitor that have been recovered and are now on display or under conservation at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. Next slide. So in March of 1862, the wooden navy of the Union in Hampton Roads was under the protective guns of Fort Monroe. This particular graphic shows the position of the USS Monitor. Now, this was well after the Battle of Hampton Roads, but I thought this was particularly good to show the protective nature of Fort Monroe's guns. Next slide. Now, the Union Navy didn't know what was coming. So Franklin Buchanan brought the CSS Virginia out of the Elizabeth River into Hampton Roads on its shakedown cruise. The crew did not know until they were underway that they were actually going to go into combat. And they were underway on March 8, 1862. For this one day, the Confederate Navy dominated Hampton Roads, with the CSS Virginia destroyed both the USS Cumberland and the USS Congress. The Virginia also shelled Camp Butler, and it severely damaged a number of other wooden vessels. From this point forward, all other wooden naval vessels were obsolete. Now, Buchanan was severely wounded during the engagement with the Cumberland, and Catesby Jones was placed in command of the Virginia. Now, that night of the first battle, the USS Monitor arrived in Hampton Roads from New York City. Next slide. Now, on March 9th, 1862, the Virginia came back into Hampton Roads to finish off the Union fleet. At this point, like I said, it was under the command of Catesby Jones. Now, the Monitor and Virginia began their 4-hour battle. In the end, this battle can be considered a draw, but both ironclads really sustained substantial internal damage. And after that initial 4 hours, they were not fit to continue combat. The Virginia now did not have potentially game-changing munition within its hull. Now there's a munition called the Brooke bolt, which I'll show you on a later slide. This Brooke bolt was designed by John Mercer Brooke for use in Brooke rifled artillery, either 7.4 or 7-inch, and it was specifically to be used against Union ironclads. It was designed to be aimed and fired to land in between the turret and the deck, so as to prevent the Union Monitor's turret from turning and making it ineffective. This munition was actually left at the Norfolk Naval Yard because Buchanan and then Catesby Jones were not anticipating to to actually be up against a Union ironclad. Next slide. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the sister ship of the CSS Virginia, and this is the CSS Richmond. Now, unlike the Virginia, this was a purpose-built from the ground up ironclad. So as you recall, the Virginia utilized the burnt out hull of the CSS Merrimack, the USS Merrimack, with the engines of the old ship. This ship was built from the ground up purposefully right to Porter and Brooke's design. It featured a complete inventory of Brooke rifled artillery pieces. Now, the plans for this ship were later captured when the Union Navy captured the Confederate ship CSS Seizure. When the Confederates evacuated Norfolk, this ship was among the vessels of the James River Squadron, which were successfully evacuated up the James River to Richmond. Now, the CSS Virginia was not able to do that. The draft on the ship was too deep, and it was not able to cross the sandbar at the entrance to the James River, and so it was destroyed in place. Next slide. Now, on the Union Navy side, I want to talk about another ironclad design, and this was the USS Galena. Now, this had been a sailing ship which had iron plate added. This design would prove completely ineffective, and later in the Civil War, the ironclad was actually removed from the USS Galena. Now, the Galena later in the Civil War took place, it did take part in the Battle of Mobile Bay, which we'll talk about later on. That is in the top left, that's a piece of the flag from the USS Galena that is in the Civil War Naval Museum in Columbus, Georgia. Next slide. Now, after the Confederate evacuation of Hampton Roads in Norfolk, the Union Navy was able to gain control of the lower reaches of the James River. And in particular, a flotilla, which included the USS Monitor and the USS Galena, attempted to get all the way to Richmond. Now, they were able to get as far as Drury's Bluff. Now, there is a very strongly fortified number of Confederate artillery positions. The artillery at Drury's Bluff actually included artillerymen that had previously been on the crew of the CSS Virginia, and they employed highly accurate artillery fire, which halted the Union ironclads completely in their tracks. Next slide. Okay, moving to another theater, just with the idea of using plating or protection for a wooden vessel. I just wanted to briefly describe General John Bankhead Magruder. Now, he'd previously been in command of the Army of the Peninsula in Hampton Roads, and he observed the destructive firepower and defensive capabilities of ironclads. Now, after the 7 Days Battle, he was sent to Texas to take command of Confederate forces in that department. Now, he had the desire to build an ironclad to help break the Union occupation of Galveston. Well, as he arrived, there is not much in the way of iron in Texas, so he had to substitute. And using ingenuity, as you can see in this picture from the Texas History Museum, Magruder was able to use the same concepts that you have in an ironclad with artillery and protective armor. In this case, it wasn't armor, it was 500-pound cotton bales. But when he substituted artillery and 500-pound cotton bales on the ship, this was pretty decisive in his operations to recapture Galveston on the 1st of January, 1863. These type of ships were called Cottonclads, and the cotton bales were effective against small caliber Union artillery, smoothbore artillery, that is. Next slide. So certainly after the Battle of Hampton Roads, the Confederacy saw, the Confederate Navy in particular, saw the potential of ironclads, and they tried to apply the design of that type of ironclad in other theaters. So the lessons learned in Hampton Roads were applied in Alabama. Franklin Buchanan was promoted to admiral, and he was sent to Mobile to be in command of the Confederate naval forces there. Catesby Jones was now a commander, and he was sent to Selma, in particular being in command of the operation with the construction of Brooke guns, and also closely supervised the construction in partnership with several others, the construction of ironclads at Selma. Lastly, Josiah Gorgas, who was chief of the Confederate Ordnance Bureau, who would settle in Alabama after the Civil War, closely supported the activities of all of these people as the efforts in Mobile and Selma gained speed. Next slide. Chiefly among this was the construction of the ironclad CSS Tennessee. This can be considered an improved version of the CSS Virginia, and it had all Brooke guns, all manufactured at Selma. And actually, the first 5 operational Brooke guns manufactured at Selma were used on the CSS Virginia. Correction, the CSS Tennessee. Next slide. I wanted to highlight just a little bit the Brooke gun. So the CSS Tennessee featured both 6.4-inch and 7.4-inch, 7-inch rifled Brooke guns. It had a forward and aft pivot gun position. So essentially those Brooke guns could be moved forward or to the sides to add to side firepower. The Tennessee was the best ironclad produced by the Confederacy, and it would later see combat at the Battle of Mobile Bay. I will say this vessel had 2 design flaws. The first was the size of that smokestack. The second is that the steering chains for the rudder were over the deck and they were not protected. So they were out in the open. Next slide. So for manufacturing the Brooke guns, Catesby Jones was able to assemble really an all-star team of experts to help him. So I wanted to highlight the contributions of a couple of people. So Charles Sims had been with Jones on the crew of the CSS Virginia. Samuel Gay had been a worker at the Tredegar Iron Works in Virginia, and he was an expert in the manufacturing of artillery. However, the most important of all these people is the gentleman in the top right. So the Englishman, Samuel Peacock, he was the iron master. And so the manufacture of each Brooke gun, the high quality and consistency of the iron was very important, and it had to be just right. In my mind, it's like making a pie. You have to have the consistency and everything just right. Now, in the center, you'll see photographs of 2 surviving Brooke cannon lathes, one today in Selma, and one is on the campus of Auburn University, but that also came from Selma. Next slide. Now, I'd like to highlight just a couple of the key components of these Brooke guns. So all of them featured the double bands you see at the back of this gun. Each of these guns was numbered S. So S for Selma, and then a number 5. So what you're looking at, this is a photograph of the pivot gun from the CSS Tennessee that's in front of the Selma City Hall today. Each of these guns was personally approved, test fired and approved by Catesby Jones. So you'll see in the bottom right, the trunnion, you'll see the initials of Catesby Jones, and in this case, this was a 7-inch Brooke. And then lastly, in the top right, that's an example of a Brooke bolt. So this is the type of munition that would have been fired, go back. This is the type of munition that would have been used against the USS Monitor had it been there. I will say in another example during the Civil War, Brooke bolts fired by land-based Brookes in Charleston were highly effective against attacking Union ironclads in a different battle. Next slide. So in Mobile, Franklin Buchanan had the goal of having 5 ironclads at his disposal for his fleet. So to get after that, besides the Tennessee, there were other ironclads built there as well. The CSS Tuscaloosa, the CSS Huntsville, as well as a side wheel ironclad similar to the CSS Nashville. You'll see there. Now that side paddle wheel ironclad was damaged on launch and was never put into practice. Just of special note, also a submersible ironclad vessel called the CSS Patrick that was also built in Selma. Now, next slide. So to take a look at things from the Union perspective, a part of Farragut's blockading squadron was the ironclad USS Chickasaw. An improvement to the USS Monitor's design This featured 2 revolving turrets with 11-inch Dahlgrens. This brought more firepower and more flexibility than the original design. And the advantage of having 2 turrets is you have actually 2 firing positions to get after the ironclad that you're fighting. This ship actually survived the Civil War, and it actually survived until the 1940s. Minus the turrets and a lot of this, the vessel was used as a ferry across the Mississippi River in New Orleans. So that's another story for another time. Next slide. So certainly during the Battle of Mobile Bay on August 5th, 1864, the fleet of Admiral David Glasgow Farragut featured 18 vessels attempting to run the blockade between Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan and enter Mobile Bay. At the front were 4 ironclads with the other 14 wooden vessels coming in a line, in 2 lines. These wooden vessels had iron chains draped over the sides, effectively producing a poor man's iron plate substitute, which actually proved reasonably effective against Confederate shore-based artillery fire. Now, the lead ironclad was the USS Tecumseh that was hit by a Confederate Singer mine, subsurface mine, and it sunk. This is where David Glasgow Farragut uttered his favorite quote, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." The CSS Tennessee was Buchanan's flagship, and at first was impervious to Union artillery fire. The iron plate on the CSS Tennessee actually worked as designed. Now, during the course of this battle, a number of Union ironclads and other vessels rammed the CSS Tennessee. The smokestack from the Tennessee was broken off by gunfire, and the chains, remember I described those, the chains on the deck were unprotected by any sort of armor. So those chains were shot away, which prevented the ability of the ironclad to steer. Now, after several hours of battle, Buchanan was forced to surrender his vessel. Next slide. Before I go into this one, I needed to add that the Union Navy was actually very impressed with the design and composition of the CSS Tennessee once it had been captured, so much so that the ship was repaired and put back into service as USS Tennessee for the rest of the Civil War. Now, another Union ironclad I'd look at is the USS Nahant. Now, the Nahant featured a very important design improvement. If you can think of these Dahlgren guns and the blunt force trauma that would be induced by the artillery. So you have these smooth bore, large caliber Dahlgren artillery pieces on these ships, and they would be able, the goal was to use the kinetic force of these projectiles to crack the hull of the Confederate ironclads. And towards the end of the Civil War, this actually proved highly effective. The USS Nahant was very active around Charleston, South Carolina. This was a very well-designed vessel, so much so that it was still in service with the U.S. Navy in 1898 at the time of the Spanish-American War, and that's when this picture was taken. Next slide. I'd like to highlight another ironclad design, this one by John Mercer Brooke. Now, he designed a special ironclad with a very low draft. This would allow a Confederate ironclad to operate in shallow inland rivers of the South. The CSS Albemarle was built in a cornfield next to a river in North Carolina. It featured 2 6.4-inch Brooke guns, and they were pivots, like the pivot guns, like the one in the CSS Tennessee. Now, there were only 2 of them, but this vessel weighed a lot less than the conventional Confederate ironclad and was actually highly successful. The CSS Albemarle was used in tandem with Confederate Army forces under General Hoke to recapture Plymouth, North Carolina from occupying Union forces, just as an example. Next slide. I'd like to take a look for a minute at the CSS Nashville. The CSS Nashville was built in Montgomery, Alabama, and was the only ironclad built in Montgomery during the Civil War. This is the same design as the failed Union ironclad at Selma that I mentioned earlier. This also had Selma-made Brooke guns. Now, this ironclad was not ready at the time of the Battle of Mobile Bay. but it was commanded by Charles Carroll Sims, who I mentioned earlier, who'd been on the crew of the CSS Virginia and had been at the Selma Navy Yard. I'll talk about this one next slide. Now, I found this ironclad unique because there's a rare instance during the Civil War where this ironclad, the CSS Nashville, as well as the CSS Tuscaloosa, were used to provide artillery support to Confederate infantry at the Battle of at the Battle of Blakely on April 2nd to 9th, 1865. Now, this is a small but very unique part of Civil War history. Next slide. So lastly, I'd like to conclude with taking a look at the massive Union ironclad USS Onondaga. This featured 2 rotating turrets with one 15-inch Dahlgren gun and one 11-inch Dahlgren gun. And in my opinion, at least for the Union ironclads that were on the James River, this is the ultimate statement of Union Navy firepower. Think of the kinetic trauma when that 15-inch Dahlgren hits a Confederate ironclad. This would actually, it was designed to crack the hull and was actually, was pretty effective at that. So the USS Onondaga fought on the James River during the final parts of the Civil War. So this is a fitting vessel to end our examination of Civil War Union ironclad technology, and I'm very happy to take any questions now.